Okay, thank you for the introduction. So this is joint work with my co-authors, Joppe and Christine van Vredendaal, also at NXP. So let me switch gears quite a bit. I'm going to be talking about quantum computers and post-quantum cryptography. I think by now most people will have seen in the news that quantum computers are being developed. Many of the large industry players are all trying to build the largest one. They have an impact on public key infrastructure. So if these quantum computers scale to be large enough to run algorithms like Shor's algorithm or Grover's algorithm, they might threaten the underlying mathematically hard problems like factoring and discrete logarithms that we need for the security of elliptic curve cryptography and RSA. Right? So academia, industry, governments were all looking for alternatives, and these alternatives are typically referred to as post-quantum cryptography. So they're cryptographic algorithms running on classical hardware, but secure even when an adversary is assumed to have access to a quantum computer. And this has been going on for quite some years, and we're now even at the stage that standardization bodies such as NIST in the US, but also European and Chinese governments are getting ready to standardize some of these algorithms. And so taking NIST as an example, they just announced the winners of the first, let's say, final round of their competition and are planning to publish a standard in about 2 years or so. Okay, and so kind of these standardization efforts have an effect on systems that are out there and the industry that is out there in various application domains, so automotive, industrial, IoT, you name it. And these parties are starting to migrate from the current PKI using ECC and RSA towards these post-quantum alternatives. And the question that we try to answer kind of on a daily basis would be, what is the impact on all these systems from large to small of migrating towards post-quantum crypto? And then, of course, the follow-up question, how can we make this migration as smooth as possible? Okay, and to kind of get into it, let me take kind of a historic step of how would you be implementing PKI or public key crypto before the post-quantum era. And so what you might have done back in the day, you picked your favorite CPU and your favorite algorithm or standard, so you could look towards ECC, so NIST FIPS 186 or PKCS for RSA. And you might just pick your favorite language and implement this on the CPU. So your favorite language might be C, and you could just implement this in software. Of course, being a computer scientist, you're not happy with just any implementation. You want your implementation to be very efficient. And so you might look for the bottlenecks of these algorithms and hand optimize them with assembly routines, making them much faster. But if you're working with very restricted CPUs, the requirements on performance might not be feasible with only software. And so instead, what a lot of these systems have done in the past is they're including dedicated hardware for these specific operations, right? So you could think about symmetric coprocessors for AES or SHA, random number generators, and for the purpose of this talk, most interestingly, coprocessors for speeding up elliptic curve crypto and RSA, which would typically come in the form of big integer multipliers and accumulators. Okay, and so yeah, if you look at existing platforms, for example, automotive processor S32G, it'll have a variety of these coprocessors for all kinds of different functionalities. Okay, and so this is kind of the status quo of the systems nowadays that were designed for ECC and RSA, and that is how they decided on their coprocessors. And so now, if we want to move towards post-quantum crypto, are they still usable? And the first kind of obvious question here is, well, why are we not just designing new hardware? And of course we should, and we are, but deploying hardware takes much longer than deploying software. And so in the meantime, while the hardware is being developed and being put out there, you still have systems which might be in the field for years to come, which can only receive software updates, and where you might still want to make the best use of your hardware that you have available. Right, so the question that we're trying to address here, if we have these new post-quantum schemes, and let's look at the NIST standardization, where a lot of these so-called lattice-based schemes are chosen as winners, the question is, can they use these existing contemporary coprocessors? Okay, to answer that question, you really have to look at what kind of operations are these algorithms really performing. So RSA and ECC are kind of similar. So for RSA 3000, you get a sequence of 3000-bit long integer multiplications and additions possibly. For ECC, you get similar behavior, but the integer operations are much smaller. They're maybe only 256 bits. And for lattices, interestingly, you don't have necessarily big integer operations. Rather, you have polynomial operations. And so these often, at least in the NIST winners, they consist of polynomials of 256 coefficients, where each of the coefficients is actually only a very small integer. So maybe 16 bits or 24 bits, but much smaller than 256 or even 3000. Right, so coprocessors are designed to speed up these integer multiplications. Can they be used also for polynomial multiplication? And the answer is yes, and the answer, this was already answered back in 1881 by Kronecker, who has an algorithm which is now named Kronecker substitution, and it's actually very simple. So suppose you have two polynomials that you want to multiply, f and g. You can simply evaluate both polynomials at a certain evaluation point. This has to be large enough, where large means relative to the sizes of the coefficients of the input polynomials. So you evaluate here at the point 100. So you get two integers as a result. You multiply those integers. And now from that integer result, you can simply read off the coefficients of the product polynomial quite easily. Right? So we're reducing polynomial multiplication to integer multiplication, plus maybe some evaluation step and some kind of interpolation step at the end. Okay, and so the question now is, can we do better? And this is also not the whole story. So I'll just do this by way of example. If you look at Saber or Kyber, which are some of the lattice-based proposals, they work with polynomials of 256 coefficients. And as an evaluation point, a very nice choice is something like 2 to the 32, which makes it very easy to perform polynomial evaluation on like a 32-bit platform. Right, and what you end up with, if you evaluate the 256 coefficient polynomial at a 32-bit value, you end up with about an 8,000-bit integer. And now if your coprocessor is only 256 bits wide, you still need to break up this big integer into a sequence of small integers. And then the question is, how can we do that, and what is the most efficient way? And I definitely don't have time to go through all of this. But the point I want to make is that there's a lot of choices you can make here, and they all impact efficiency quite differently. But let me just run through a couple. If you're familiar with some multiplication algorithms, you might just use schoolbook multiplication, which has a quadratic complexity. And in this example, you end up with about 1,000 multiplications on your coprocessor. You can use techniques such as Karatsuba, recursive Karatsuba, which reduce the multiplications quite a bit, or even Thom-Cook methods, which can reduce the number of multiplications even further. There are more esoteric methods, like Schönhage-Strassen, which kind of mimic fast Fourier or NTT, number theoretic transformation type techniques, which can reduce the number of multiplications even further, but they increase the size of each of the multiplications. So in this example, it doesn't actually lead to a more efficient implementation. Then there's Nussbaumer, which is a polynomial multiplication algorithm, which can work quite well. But we propose a new method, which we call Kronecker Plus, which is kind of similar to Nussbaumer in its first step, but then we combine it together with Kronecker and together with, again, fast Fourier or number theoretic transformation techniques to reduce the number of multiplications to only 32, which is less than any of the other multiplication techniques. There's a big caveat here, a big warning that just counting the number of multiplications that definitely does not tell you the full story. There's a lot of overhead that should be taken into account, but also there we compare very well to the other algorithms. Okay, so we implemented this on a proprietary NXP platform. It is a RISC-V CPU, and it's coupled with a coprocessor that can perform multiplications up to 4,000 bits. And here we measure it in thousands of CPU cycles. I should note the comparison here is compared to a C reference implementation, which is slightly unfair, of course. If you were to optimize this in assembly, the number of cycles would go down, but we would still be quite a bit faster. So here, compared to the C reference implementation, we measure the two bottleneck operations of the Saber algorithm, which is kind of a matrix vector multiplication, where each element is a polynomial, and an inner product between two vectors of polynomials. And we get a speed up of a factor of about 10. So what happens if you look at the runtime of the whole algorithm, you see that the cost of the arithmetic operations, so polynomial operations, is basically reduced to being almost negligible, and the whole remainder of the cost is dominated, in this case, by SHA-3 operations. Okay, so to summarize and to conclude, post-quantum cryptography is coming, even if we're not sure when quantum computers will be ready to break public key crypto. The migration towards post-quantum cryptography is already very much underway. And so we kind of looked at how can we use contemporary hardware to speed up these post-quantum algorithms, and we conclude that at least for some of them that rely on polynomial multiplication, you can definitely benefit from this existing hardware. The real performance benefit you gain really depends on what is your CPU, what is your coprocessor, how is the communication arranged between them. And so yeah, if you want to do this on your own platform, you have to take all these things into account. Okay, so let me stop there. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.